I see you, but I don't hear you.
How's that going now?
All right, we see you and we hear you.
There we go. There we go. This is the life of a lawyer trying to learn how to do bastard luddite streaming technology. It's just a disaster constantly.
No worries. Give me 1 second. I'm just trying to... I want my chat to block your thing here. There we go.
So is my name reversed on your screen or not?
I'm reading it Ryan Mullally. So I'm seeing it as Ryan Mullally. But it's your camera is cutting. It's like only the top half of your name.
Oh, okay. Well, these are things I can work on. I'm certainly not going to work on them now.
Well, Ryan, thanks so much for taking the time out. Let's get into it. I think at some point you had gestured towards the idea. Let me scoot over. Fucking centered camera. I think at some point you had gestured towards the idea that socialism is evil. And, you know, I do want to say, I square this one for me, okay? This doesn't mean to be... I'm curious what your answer is. I don't mean this to sound like a gotcha. You've said that you wouldn't call Trump evil, but you would call socialism evil. And this seems kind of bizarre to me. So what's your framework for whether or not you would call something or someone evil that would exclude Trump but include socialism?
Yeah, so evil's a high bar. I know you've flirted with utilitarianism, and now I think some kind of utilitarian egalitarianism, so that's your moral system. I'm a natural rights theorist. So the first question I ask when I ask if something is immoral is it violative of the natural rights to which we are all owed? And Trump does violate those rights from time to time in some places, which I consider to be immoral and I am critical of. But his entire goal, it's not an ideology that is based purely around that. Whereas I think if you ask, and I know your version, your model's different, and I'm talking more about the kind of pure ideology, not your model at the moment. We can get to your model in a moment later on, and I have different critiques of that. But the actual goal of socialism, which includes the abolition of private property, is violative of natural rights. So it is an immoral end in and of itself because it is seeking to abolish what I consider to be a moral foundation.
Okay, so you wouldn't call Trump evil. You would just say that he does a lot of individual evil acts.
Yeah, I think you can talk about his character, and there are bad things he does, and there's things I'm incredibly critical of, and I would call immoral. But if I'm going to say, when I say
call them
socialism
evil.
Immoral, oh yeah, when I say socialism, I didn't actually. You did, but I said it was immoral, and then you said, "Would you like to talk about it being evil?" And I said, "Sure." But
well, no, hold on, right? Because I do recall the tweet. I couldn't find. I don't know if you clear your Twitter on a regular basis, but. You in the replies, you did use the word evil yourself, right? You didn't say immoral, if I recall correctly.
I said immoral, and then you said evil, and then I said I'd be happy to chat. But we can, if you want to pull that up, I'm delighted to be proven wrong. The issue that I have with the comparison is that Trump does immoral things, but socialism is an immoral end. Like the actual abolition of private property rights, the abolition of the right to alienate your own labor, these are immoral because they are seeking to violate natural rights, not because of some outcome or how it turns out. It's just attempting to do something that I consider to be immoral on like an axiomatic level. So the end itself is the problem. It's the equivalent of if somebody said, like, I would like to install fascism. Like, I think it's an immoral end. Whether or not you have a great way of accomplishing it is irrelevant. The end you're seeking to do is immoral.
Well, I mean, do you think, and this is the last thing I'll say on Trump before we get into the substance of socialism. I don't want to be on the offense the entire time. Do you think that Trump and his attempts to overthrow democracy in 2020 would count as an immoral end, which would, in my view, you know, under your framework, mean that Trump himself is an immoral, evil person?
I think that the attempt to overthrow, I think the attempt to bypass the election process in 2020 was immoral. I've been incredibly critical about it. In fact, I cite it as the reason I didn't vote for him.
Well, that was his goal. His goal was to end American democracy as we know it.
Well, no, that was not his goal. Was not to end American democracy as we know it. His end was to get another term at any cost, which was also immoral. But
at the cost of American, our democracy would not exist as we know it if Trump's plan had succeeded.
There would be severe alterations, but having a two-term president is not the end. It would have been a very bad.
Wait. We're not talking. Hold on, Ryan. Come on. We're not talking about having a two-term president. We're talking about a president.
And we're still talking about fucking Trump, by the way.
Hey, it's only the first. It's only the first 10 minutes. Only the first 10 minutes. Okay. Yeah. We're not talking about having a two-term. Yeah. We're talking about a president's second term coming on the back of him destroying the democratic process of our country, right? And that is an end of Trump, and he would have accomplished that if our institutions hadn't stopped him. And I would say that that's an immoral end.
Yeah, and if Trump's entire policy platform was if his entire platform was as it is commonly described, meaning I would like to install fascism, then I have no problem saying that's immoral. Like, you asked about Trump, the human being, who has a lot of bad characteristics, a lot of terrible traits. He does a lot of things I disagree with. I would probably call short of calling him evil, but I think it's very different to call a person evil versus calling a system of thought or an ideology evil. Because a system of thought doesn't have redeeming characteristics and positives and negatives and bad traits and good traits. It is just what it purports to be, an idea. And socialism is a very bad idea, and it doesn't have the redeeming characteristics, that somebody else might have.
For the sake of again, not being on the offense about Trump the entire time, I won't respond to that, and I'll move on. So on socialism specifically, you said you kind of hinted at your argument. You said socialism is evil, or it's immoral, because it violates natural rights. Because my socialism is the collective ownership of the means of production. So clearly there's some natural right associated with the private ownership of the means of production. And so is that what you're saying? You're saying that private property ownership is a natural right?
Yes, and just for those who have read his Substack or have read it carefully, I'm just caveating, we're talking about ideal socialism right now, not your model, which I think we would both agree is not ideal socialism. And we can talk about what it is and isn't down the road. I'm sure we'll get to that. But yeah, in ideal socialism, it's not just the social ownership of the means of production, but the mandatory social ownership of the means of production. Like, it's not, it is not a choice, because you have that choice in a capitalist system, right? Like, there is no barrier to having a worker commune. That you can do that right now if you want to. The issue in a idealistically socialist state is that you no longer have the right to alienate your labor. You no longer have the right to self-ownership. You no longer have the right to private property. You no longer have the right to improve your private property and benefit from that production. And these are core, I would say, Lockean Enlightenment values that came out of that era. They're core values that are enshrined in our founding documents. These are essentially core American values. So when those things are removed, that is, in my mind, immoral.
Okay, but you would agree that we don't live under a regime that even closely approximates Lockean property rights. And I think you would also agree that we do a lot of things in our current modern day society, which would, I think, under that framework, stand in violation of what you just described. We have tax revenue and tax spending. There's a lot of private property rights that we don't. You don't have the private property right to open up a heroin factory, right? There's all kinds of regulation. You can't just open any business you want, right? So, would you say that those are acceptable? Do you think that they're violations of natural rights and they're immoral, but that's just it's not my ideal society? Or
the difference between me and I'm trying to think who I'd think of. I've never actually spoken to Fabian Liberty, so I don't want to characterize him this way. But a pure libertarian is that they're gonna talk about these in absolute pure terms. And I think that the better way of looking at it is through kind of a historical lens and say, what are these freedoms? What were they? What are they? Like, when you ask freedom of speech, for example, when we say the freedom of speech, the freedom of speech is not total freedom of speech. The freedom of speech is the freedom of speech we inherited from England, which includes certain limitations, including you can't incite violence, right? So there are, the fact that there are some limitations on these rights isn't inherently necessarily problematic as long as they kind of comport with their historic analogs. I do think we're trending in a bad direction in that regard socially right now. I think that I'm sure we're going to get into this later, but our federal government is way too big and way too sweeping and does way too many things. And that is a bit of a problem, but I think that might be too in the weeds for where we are right now.
Okay, so you're saying, okay, we've got private property as a natural right. So how is it that we establish a right of property? What is the actual right that we're discussing here? So I own something. And when does that become morally good? Because again, I think you would agree we don't actually have Lockean property rights in our country. Is that how you do it? You mix your labor with it, and that's how private property rights are established, or how do we establish property rights?
Yeah, I mean that's the foundational idea. I mean, it becomes, in a long historic society, it becomes complicated, right? Like if you look at real property, the idea there is that the state essentially owns all the property in the state, and that you, when you buy it, put chain title all the way back to the state itself, which is why if you leave your property fallow, the state can reclaim it. That's the legal theory, at least. But yeah, that is the idea, that when you acquire ownership of something and you improve upon it with your labor, with your ingenuity, with your ideas, with your work, with your capital, then you, subject to, and even Locke would say, subject to some rational limits, are entitled to the fruits of that. And that's critically important because that's a right that if you were on a desert island, you would have that right. That would be totally fair and natural. It is part of who it is to be you. And when you measure the justice of a government, one of the things, and it says in the Declaration of Independence that you ought to do, is measure the government in terms of whether or not it is infringing upon this sort of right.
Okay, yeah, but again, we don't live under that standard, right? And I think that standard is really quite a bad one. So, for instance, do you think that inheritance is a moral claim to property, right? Because like when I inherit money, I didn't do any work to essentially earn that money, right? When I am just a capitalist, when I just have a bunch of ownership of things and those other workers are doing all the work and then I'm collecting dividend checks, I'm not doing any active work to earn that money, right? Like that's just money that I'm earning as well. So are we kicking out inheritance, or should it be taxed at 100%? You know,
do you have kids?
I don't have kids, no.
Okay. One of the primary reasons that people do anything is to make their children's lives better. That's, like, to be candid with you, like if I didn't have kids and just wanted to like live a small, quiet life somewhere, I could stop being a lawyer tomorrow. There are ways you can acquire enough to live on. It's not necessarily easy. It's not possible for everyone. I'm not saying that, but like most of the things that consume my thoughts and time are about long-term, how can I make my life better for my children? So yes, I do think that, and this is not a statement of tax policy, and we can get into that if that's interesting to you, but the right to pass on resources to your children and make their lives better as the result of your efforts is a primary motivating factor for human beings, and it is wrong to prevent that from happening.
Okay,
that doesn't mean you can't tax it, but that's a separate question.
So one exception to the Lockean proviso is if the passing on of it goes to your children, but you didn't address the private capitalist that just earns from his ownership and not from his work. And then number two, I think I should ask, like, what are all the exceptions here, right? So we got one exception where if you spend the money on your kids, who gives a shit about the Lockean proviso and Lockean property rights? But address the capitalist point. They don't do any work to earn the money that they're currently earning. And then what are all the different exceptions to Lockean property rights, basically?
I mean, I take exception to what you said about who gives a shit. I think that's totally compatible. The idea is that you have developed property, you have made it better, you have created something that is of worth to people, and as a result, you've acquired resources. One of the reasons that you're doing that is to make your children's lives better. There's nothing unnatural or strange about wanting to then give those resources to your children.
But
In fact, I'd say
kids
that's
didn't
the
do
most
any.
natural thing.
The kids didn't do any work for it, though. They're violating the Lockean property.
It's my property. I have the right to use it. I have the right to give it to people. I have the right to give it to my children. I have earned it. That's the fact that it has been earned in the Lockean model doesn't mean that the person I hand it to has to earn it from scratch all over again. The only criteria there is that the person I'm giving it to, I believe it is a worthy transaction. If I give $3 to the coffee shop for a cup of coffee, it's not a moral question about whether or not the coffee is truly worth $3. I have decided that in my mind, this is a good transaction, and I have given them this property in exchange for a cup of coffee. That's the moral implications are kind of written into the exchange. Similarly, if I give my kids property because I want their lives to be together, not in exchange for anything, but because I want to help them, there's no issue there. That doesn't contradict at all with Lockean property theory or natural rights theory. It, in fact, is the logical extension of it.
Okay, so I completely disagree with that, number one. I think that when Locke says you have a right to property, you have this natural right to property, he's saying, you mix your labor with something and then it becomes yours by default. Now, Locke, I don't know what Locke's views on inheritance were, obviously. I mean, there were early liberal thinkers that were skeptical. Yeah, there were early liberal thinkers that were at least skeptical, let's say, of property rights. But let's just say that you give the inheritance to anyone who's not your kid. Oh, well, I guess you're just going to say, okay, well, it's yours, so you can do with it as you please. Okay, whatever.
Well, that's what yours means.
Well, right, but again,
if it's yours, then you have the right to alienate it. That's what it means.
Well, but the idea that you specifically, if you inherited something, you have a moral claim to this property. Well, you can't default to the Lockean proviso, right? Because they're not doing any work to actually obtain that property in the first place. Now, forget about that for a second. Let's talk about the Lockean proviso in its first place. I think that on the capitalist point, right? So capitalists don't do anything to actually, labor and earn their money, right? So what would be the argument for which the capitalist has a right to the property in the first place?
They improved it. Are you talking about somebody who invests money in something and then the money increases as a result? Like that what you're talking about?
Yeah, they're not mixing their labor.
Shark Tank. Yeah, but I think it would be obvious that I do not subscribe to the labor theory of value, right? Like that's not.
Well, I'm talking about the Lockean proviso. The Lockean proviso, basically, you mix your labor with something and it's yours, and you have to leave as much and as good for the rest of society.
You improve something.
Well, we're jumping around on semantics here. So the Lockean proviso is
the easiest way to improve something is with your labor. That's like the desert island example, and that's because you have nothing else to give. But if I invest in a startup and as a result they are able to do business that they would not otherwise have been able to do, and I get a percentage of that business in return for my investment, I'm taking a risk. I'm risking my capital. They use the money. If it works, then I'm rewarded. If it doesn't work, then I'm not rewarded. I'm attempting to improve this business by infusing my capital into it. That's not different than what you're suggesting.
It absolutely is. So the Lockean proviso was like squarely about labor. Right, like he uses the words like work and labor. Right, he didn't just say like giving money to someone is a form of mixing your labor with something. Right, like I think that's an addition to Locke. If you wanted to say that okay, well, someone giving money to someone is like necessarily improving it on account of their labor. I don't think that's a sort of ordinary understanding. I don't think that was Locke's understanding of what it meant to establish property rights either. Again,
of course it is. I do something. I use my labor. It improves. I sell that thing. Now I have fungible assets. How did I get them? My labor. Now let's say I invest those fungible assets into a startup. The startup does well. Now my assets have improved yet again. Like the moral claim is the baseline claim. But
okay,
transfers.
Let me just read. This is just quickly from the Wikipedia page. This is a quick quote from Locke himself. Though the earth and all inferior creature be common to all men, yet every man has a property in his own person. This no body has any right to but himself. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are property his. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature hath provided, and left in it, he hath mixed his labor with, and joined to it something that is his own, and therefore makes it his property. So I think again, if you just want to say, look, I just have a different view from Locke, right? Locke is clearly, squarely talking about people doing work. He's not talking about just anybody who contributes financially to something. Can we at least agree that
Locke is working from first principles, right? So like if you're doing philosophy and you're trying to isolate all the other variables and you're working from first principles, and I mean, I don't think we need to spend the whole time talking about Locke, but if you're on a desert island and you improve something, you have the right to what you have improved, right? Are you suggesting that Locke would say that if you trade that for something else, you don't have a right to the thing you traded it for? Like if we're on a desert island and I make a hammock and you make some cups, if I trade you the hammock for a cup, I don't have a right to the cup because I didn't make the cup? Like that's obviously not what Locke is talking about. What he's talking about is that the foundational right may come from improving property, from labor in many cases. But once you have a property right, of course, the right has to be transferable. And I think it's a very wild reading of Locke to think that he doesn't think that you can transfer your moral right to property ownership. I don't know how you think there could be an economy under his system otherwise.
But like you just said, right, it's all grounded in the fundamental right to property and the working and using of labor to mix your property with it. So I don't know that Locke would say, like, you can't trade things, right? But I think that he would say that your fundamental right to property is based on the labor in which you infuse your property with.
Self-ownership, yes.
Right.
And so it's on the right to self-ownership, but then once I have acquired a moral claim to something, I can trade that thing. I can dispose of that thing. I can give it to my children. They inherit the moral claim when I give it to them. You get the moral claim when I transfer to you. That's not, I think, difficult to understand.
Let's just move on. You're right. We shouldn't debate Locke the entire time. Okay. In actually existing economies, you would agree that we don't actually have Lockean property rights, right? Like, not even close. And so that's why I asked you, what are all the exceptions? So essentially, how do we establish the natural right of property? Like, how do we actually determine who owns things in society? Right now, we don't have Lockean property rights. We do have some inheritance. You can't only give inheritance to your kids. You can give it to anybody, right? So essentially, how do we determine are we basically just saying, like, you have a right to property if the law says you have a right to your property? Or are we saying that the moral right to property is much more expansive than Locke? Like, what are all the exceptions?
I mean, I think I would not be able to list every exception. I think it's a historical exercise that we'd have to work through an example or some kind. But the idea being that you fundamentally have a right to the property, there are going to be exceptions. There are going to be trade-offs, and no system, I think we would both agree, is perfect or like gets everything right all the time. So there are going to be trade-offs in any system. I think maybe we accept that as a baseline.
There's going to be trade-offs in any system, sure.
Yeah. Okay. So my reservation about socialism is that in its purest form, it erases private property right completely, not partially, not based on some kind of exception, completely. And that strikes me as an immoral end. And I guess that doesn't concern you at all, despite the rich history of that going very badly.
No, not at all. Because again, I think that when we talk about what it means to abolish the right of private property, I think that we might be talking about two very fundamentally different models and like ways in which that would actually be enacted. Like, I don't think it would be bad to essentially have democratic institutions manage how we, determine the coordination of property and the ownership of property itself. And when we talk about property, we're also talking about essentially private businesses, right? So when we're talking about like the ownership and the abolition of private property, right? So you'd still have rights to private property in my system in a very sort of brutal sense. You could still have a toothbrush, you could still have a table if you wanted, you could still have a camera if you wanted, right? We're talking about the right to own a business, right? And you're saying, well, that is just like such an offensive thing to the idea of a natural right. You have essentially a natural right to own a business and to start a business, right? But I don't really recognize that. It's like, who's determining what a natural right even is? Why is it a natural right to own a business? You referenced Locke in part, but that seems
and
ultimately
the Declaration of Independence, the founding understanding, the general understanding of what the pursuit of life and liberty and happiness is. That these are, when the Declaration of Independence says that these are inalienable rights, that's what they're referring to, is the rights that people have, not because they were given to them by a government, but because it is intrinsic to being a human. And this, by the way,
we certainly couldn't make the argument. I hope, just to be clear for the audience, you're certainly not making the argument that the Declaration of Independence determines what is or isn't a natural right? Like that would be far too simple.
I think I'm referencing the Declaration of Independence because it's a useful starting point for what is and is not American morality. Like that it was the document where we wrote down
what's a natural right. How do we come to those things?
So the reason I reference the Declaration of Independence is that natural rights theory is intrinsically linked to religious belief. So we are creating the image of God. We have natural rights as a result of that. And that's the phrasing used in the Declaration of Independence. I don't think you have to be religious to ascribe to that, which is why I'm referencing the Declaration, because it's just a common American value at this point. But that's where natural rights theory comes from. It comes from the idea that humans have a special dignity and worth, and that these rights are intrinsic to us. It contrasts meaningfully, by the way, with, like, for example, Soviet Russia, where Soviet Russia said all human rights are creations of the state. And we saw how that went, because if they're creations of the state, then the state is in charge of them. And the state is in charge of how good and how bad, how much you should get. It's up to the state, and the state can do no wrong in that scenario because the state is the final arbiter. So I think that there's a long track record of what it looks like to have human rights based off of our inalienable characteristics versus the alternative, and I'm quite happy with that record.
Well, but an inalienable characteristic of people is not to be business owners, right? Like, it's clear that there's many business owners, there's many people who, like, many more people who are never business owners, right?
Self-ownership, which can then turn into business ownership, but that's the inalienable right, self-ownership, which then creates property rights.
Well, okay, but in my system, you can have self-ownership, but then just not be able to start a private bit. Like, what's the difference between the two, right? Like, why is it that I can't have self-ownership? I can't enact freely in the world, right? In some, like, extremely foundational sense, just because you can't start a private business? Again, like, you would already agree that we have things like taxes and spending and public institutions and there's, like, so many ways that our private property rights system is highly constrained, right? And so I'm saying, well, I would add in one additional regulation, which is that businesses would have to be collectively owned in one way or another. And so this is, are you saying that there's, like, a threshold argument, like eventually it goes too far, or, like, how do we make the jump?
Let's work through it. Not your model, ideal socialism. I'm a lawyer, right? Can I do legal work for other people in exchange for money?
Yeah, that's just labor. Okay.
Can I hire a paralegal?
In my system, if you were going to start a business, it would have to be collectivized in some way, in some ideal sense, like you said.
Okay. Can I hire a driver?
Yeah, like sole proprietorship to sole proprietorship. Why not?
Okay. Can I employ a court reporter to help to transcribe things when we do a deposition?
Well, it would depend on if you're hiring them as a part of your business, or if they're, like, working at a cooperative, or they have their sole proprietorship or something.
Do I need government approval to then start this cooperative, or can I just do it on my own?
Well, we would have a set of regulations just like we have today when it comes to starting businesses.
Okay, so if I want to get a business, I need it to be approved by the government.
Just like today, by the way.
And then, well, I mean, you could do it for less than $50 and it's automatic. There's no... Yeah.
We should have a good administrative state.
And by the way, critically, it is federal, so that it varies by state to state, which creates actual competition between the states to have good rules, as opposed to your system, which I assume would be national.
Federal permits are vast. Like, many businesses require federal permits.
To start a business, you don't need a federal permit. To start a business, you need, like, an LLC.
To establish a corporation, yes, but to enact, to actually enact your business, many businesses require federal permits in order to.
There's a ton of federal law, but you don't need, like, if I wanted to start a law firm tomorrow, I do not need federal approval. That's ridiculous.
Well, Well, okay, but if I, for instance, if I wanted to start a company that builds solar farms, I could start an LLC and say the purpose of this company is to build solar farms, but you can't build a solar farm unless you have federal permits, right? So is that a really is
There's no question. There's a ton of areas where there's a lot of federal law, but I'm trying to work through your system. And you're asking, where do property rights end? So if you're starting with, I'm trying to create a national solar farm business, that seems like you jumped a few steps. I was starting with, I am currently a lawyer. I can be a lawyer. You're saying I need to give my paralegal a part of my business in order to hire a paralegal, and I would need government approval for that.
you would, yeah, you would have to, again, you'd have to have some collectively owned production if it was going to be your own business, right? So I've never denied that, right? But again, what I feel like what we're saying is, and that's why I asked you if it's just a threshold thing, because in our current,
Let's stick with it. So this is the essential problem. You're saying the paralegal does not have the right to alienate her labor for a wage instead of for ownership percentages if she so chooses, and I don't have a right to run my business and to ply my trade without giving a portion of it to someone who, for the record, like a paralegal is not a lawyer. Like, she can't do the legal work. So, or, he or she. So there are like, this is the quintessential violation. Like, I think we've walked through it right now. Like, I can go from one person to illegal state control in the just by attempting to hire someone to help me with the work. And that level of creeping state control, and in your case, it would be national control, federal government all over the country. It wouldn't be state by state, because for socialism to work, it would, I assume, have to be national. You can correct me if I'm wrong. That strikes me as hugely violative of natural rights. It's also probably unconstitutional, but that's another topic.
well, but again, what I'm trying to point out here is that, and Ryan, I mean, obviously you know this as a lawyer, that the government already totally controls property rights. There's no property right. That's absolutely true. There is no transaction. There's the arm of the state is ultimately involved in all of the enforcement of all property rights.
Is not the same thing.
It is. What are you talking? Okay, so you're telling me that right now we couldn't pass a constitutional amendment to abolish private property rights and have a complete state. We could do that right now. We could give the state the power to do that if we wanted, right? The state enforces every property right that we have.
If we're going to presuppose a pie-in-the-sky constitutional amendment, I mean, with a constitutional amendment, you could do anything. With a constitutional amendment, you could, in theory, impose the death penalty on everyone in the country. I don't understand your point.
My point is that the state. My point is that the state is already involved in every transaction that we make. Right, every transaction that we make, the state is involved in.
Involved, not controlled.
Well,
and are you talking the federal government, or are you talking about state governments?
Well, but in a system where we have collective ownership of the means of production, I could just say the same thing, that the state doesn't literally control every transaction. The state just regulates it in certain ways, right?
Well, but okay, you don't see a qualitative difference between I need an LLC versus I need permission to have a business. LLC is automatic. It's literally it's $50 in a form. You're done. You just have it. And by the way, you can run the business without it. You don't need an LLC to do the business. It's just advantageous.
Well, you need some like permission from the state to essentially operate any business. You need to pay taxes and follow all these regulations and stuff.
I mean, but you can just do business. Lots of people just do business without having a formal legal structure. It's disadvantageous to do so, and I would advise them to find some legal counsel to help them out with it. But that doesn't mean you can't operate a business. There's kids in my neighborhood who cut grass. If one of them was paying the others, you're saying that they would need state permission to do that. Like,
you already need state permission to operate business. You have to pay taxes. You have to follow You cannot just open a business and do whatever you want with that business, right? And so what I'm saying is,
open a business, you can't do literally whatever you want. But
Ryan, how is that meaningful? I can have a piece of paper that says I have a business and hang it on a wall. But if you can't actually meaningfully operate that business without the permission of the state, how are these different things?
Do you make money streaming?
Yeah.
What government body did you apply to for permission to make that money?
Well, there's multiple different ways. I didn't apply, but what you're saying is
you didn't apply because you just started a business.
Ryan,
you just started streaming
hold on.
It became a business, obviously.
Ryan, let's just imagine. No. Let's imagine this. Let's imagine this. Okay. Let's imagine that in my system, you didn't have to apply to form the collective business, right? Let's say we had some like wild, sophisticated system of managing transactions, and it was just automatic. Oh, we saw that you hired an employee. Automatically, we're going to credit their account with 50% of the equity in it, right? There's no application process. It's just happening automatically. I don't think you would say, well, because there's no piece of paper involved and because the state's not involved, that the state isn't involved in that process just because it's automatic. Just because things are happening in the background, it doesn't mean that the state isn't involved. I mean, obviously.
What you are, the level of like wild conflation of things that you're doing here is,
how is this a conflation?
Getting there. Like, let's go back.
All right, let's go back.
You stream. You make some money streaming.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You hire an editor. You start paying the editor, and maybe you pay them a percentage, maybe you pay them by the hour. That's between you and the editor. Are there some constraints on that? Possibly. There's minimum wage laws. There are things that might have some constraints in our country on that. But at what point did the government get involved? Like, at what point did you have to have state imprimatur on this? You can just do it. You just do it. And then, you owe some taxes. There's stuff there's downstream consequences, but it's just a thing you do. You can't just
do business in the. That's what I'm saying. The government is involved in every transaction in one way or another, right? The government decides ultimately. Like in property, when you take your property law class in law school, you learn that property is a matter of. Property is a matter of law, not a matter of fact. Right? It is the law that dictates who owns what and who's entitled to what, right? It is the law that enforces the entirety of property rights, right? So the idea that in our current society, you can just start a business and start doing business, that's not true. That's not true. You need a crazy amount of government involvement in order to...
It's obviously true, but then there are situations you can get into where there's more or less government involvement. As you said, you didn't speak to anyone in the government before you may started a streaming business, and nor would you have to. Now, I'm a lawyer. There are things I would have to do.
I described a socialist system where you don't have to speak to the government, but you would still say the government's involved in that process, even though you're not speaking to anyone.
The conflation that I think this is why you're so comfortable with ideas that I think are really dangerous, and I think if implemented disastrous, and then we can get into that, is that you do not view the government as a necessary evil. You view the government I think you're... I don't know, maybe just you think that it's generally good or generally neutral. Whereas the view that I'm espousing is that there is government involvement. We should have the least amount of it we possibly can, but there is some amount that we are going to need. So, okay, there are practical considerations. We can work that out. But what you're presupposing and comparing to our current situation is sweeping and invasive powers on every person in the country, as opposed to the current state of affairs where that you, in our own example, were able to start a business while doing none of those things.
There's sweeping and pervasive powers that the state already has, right? So, I mean, you would agree, like right now we've got ICE agents that are walking around in unmarked and unmasked, or masked and unmarked cars going around blackbagging people and throwing them in prison, right? I mean, that's a pretty insane power that we give the state. You might disagree with that power. Yeah.
What is the connection to property rights there?
So the connection is you're saying, well, the government should be as small as possible, right? The government should be as small as possible. I can, in principle, agree with that. I don't want more government than we otherwise need, obviously. But what I disagree with is this fundamental...
You are suggesting the largest expansion of the federal government that would ever have happened. That, like, you are suggesting the federal government expand to cover every single business, every single transaction, everything.
Every single business and every single transaction is already covered by the government. You agreed. You have to at least register with the government your business. You have to pay taxes on your business. You have to follow a whole billion different regulations. You have to follow a whole billion different set of regulations in order to operate your business. You might, like you said, have additional permitting requirements to open up. But Ryan, you can't just open a law firm. You have to be educated in a specific way that the government requires.
I'm so glad you brought that example up. One of the absolute geniuses of our system, which would be absolutely destroyed by your system, is that because America is vast, and because there are different ideas of how to do things, we have the capacity to have state by state regulation where the states can see what works. So yes, my ability to open a law firm is contingent on state law. But what you're presupposing is a federal sweeping change to the entire economy. And what that kills is the laboratory of experimentation where people can actually see what works, because you can go, oh shit, California's doing that. It looks great. Let's replicate it down here. Or shit, California's doing that. It's a disaster. Let's not do that.
Ryan, if the state of California implemented my preferred system, I don't think you'd say that that was moral just because it was on the state level, right? I mean, of course not.
I would be opposed to it, but it would be substantially more moral.
You'd
and
say
the
it was
reason
immoral.
it's substantially more moral is that people who are opposed to it could just leave.
People can just leave the country. What are you talking about?
That's a little different to have to leave your country versus freely travel across the state line. You think those two are equivalent?
No, they're not equivalent. But again, if we're making I hope that we're staying in the realm of basic principles, right? So again, if the basic principle is you can just leave if you don't like the system, well, in a federal system, you can just leave the country if you want, right? So the basic principle would still apply there.
In a federal system, we recognize that giving creeping powers to the federal government is disadvantageous because it leads to tyranny. When you give the same power to a state, it is not the same level of concern because people have the freedom to travel between the states and the freedom to live in any of the states.
That's a practical concern.
Which mitigates that concern. I do not have the freedom to live in any other country. When we talk about, and furthermore, if we're talking about American values, federalism is a core American value. So yes,
we're not talking about American values.
Federalism is going to be better than a system that doesn't.
So we're not talking about American values here, right? So we're just trying to keep. I'm trying to keep it in the realm of just your basic principles here, right? I think in a basic sense, well, I don't think a basic principle of yours is violated if you're saying, oh, it's fine if you can leave. Well, again, I'm not forcing. I'm not forcing anybody to stay. Obviously, right? You can leave if you want.
In your ideal system, would this be national or would this be state by state?
Well, I'd have a national model, but again, people can leave the country if they want. I'm not. It's not North Korea. You're not forced to stay here.
You're asking, I mean, why is socialism immoral? Because one of the things that would be immoral about it is that it would destroy federalism. So we can add that to the growing list of immoral problems with it.
Well, because wait, hold on. No.
Of course, it would have to be national, and it's a great example because if it wasn't national, then all the capital would just move to other states.
Federalism does not mean you don't do things on the federal level. Okay, obviously you could have like a standard for property rights on the federal level, but still devolve things to the states. Right? So again, I think we're conflating our terms here between like practically what does America look like and principally what's actually a violation of my principles here. Like I think that ultimately. Yeah, go on, sorry.
I think we have a federal government of limited powers. And the reason, and I think one of the things that people really commonly miss when they talk about rights is they look at our Bill of Rights and they say, those are the rights we have, and isn't that wonderful? But the thing that makes the rights matter is the limitation on federal power. The rights themselves, have you ever read the Constitution for Soviet Russia?
Yeah, no, I've seen what you're talking about, where you have to enforce the different right. I think you're muted on accident. I don't know if you muted on accident, but
here. Oh, sorry. I'll read you some. This is like
no, but I already understand your point.
That the right to education, this ensured by universal compulsory education. They have the right to maintenance in old age. They have the right to rest and leisure. They have the right to work. They have the right to employment and payment for their work in accordance with its quantity and quality. They have the right to freedom of speech and the press and dignity. It's It is remarkable how many more rights on paper citizens in Soviet Russia had than we do. The problem is rights only matter if they are coupled with a system that is broken up, separated, limited in powers such that the state cannot then take those rights away from you. So the problem that I'm having here is that you are now suggesting a new sweeping federal level power which would completely dominate and control and reshape the US economy, and that strikes me as an incredibly dangerous thing.
So again, but what you're talking about is something that I don't think is as fundamentally different from how we already currently do things, right? Now, I don't want to belabor the point. We can move on to other things, but I don't think it's fair to say that, hey, Econoboy, your system is evil or immoral because you want to reestablish property rights such that people can't own private businesses anymore. But I'm essentially more or less okay, or at the very least, it's not so crazily bad that we basically have the state involved in every single transaction in a number of different ways, in a number of different layers, and every single property right that we have is ultimately enforced by the state with violence. I don't find that that's and I don't disagree with all that. I think it's totally fine to have the state involved in the economy and have the state do certain things. Obviously, we have a democratic framework. I think that's totally fine. But what I'm asking is, why do we jump? Are we basically just saying the threshold is you have to be able to open a private business and everything else is more or less okay or not as offensive? Is that the threshold? And if that's the threshold, why is that specifically the threshold?
No, that was an example we were working through, so I could articulate your ideal.
Well, that's the whole point. Socialism is the collective ownership of production. We're talking about businesses here. We're saying in my system, you can't open a private business. In your system, you can open a private business. But why is there a huge leap of the system being moral and immoral when you can't open a private business? But in the current system that we live in, you can't do basically shit for business without the state being involved in almost every stage of that process and in the transactions.
I think that you are wildly, again, conflating the idea that the state has some involvement versus the idea that I have to give a percentage of my business to anyone who becomes involved with it. That doesn't strike you as a massive change, at least in quality. That seems like a completely different thing to me than anything we've talked about.
Well, I'm not saying that my system isn't a big change, but that's why I'm asking is what is, okay, for instance, if we were to say, hey, we're going to establish a minimum wage. You are no longer allowed to alienate your labor such that you are willing to work for lower than the minimum wage, right? Every single business has to follow that regulation. Every single business has to follow all the billion different labor laws and civil rights that we have. Every single business has to be registered with the state in some way. Every single business has to pay taxes and give up like 30% of their income to the state, right? Like we're saying the country forcing every single business to give up 30% of its income. That's, I guess, I mean, you might say that that's immoral, but at least like that's like something that's just on background. That's not like that big of a deal compared to saying you have to give up some portion of your equity to your employees. I mean, in that sense, in an accounting sense, that's just another form of tax, essentially.
So I think maybe this example will make the immorality of it a bit more clear.
Yeah, just paint. I just want to know the bright line here.
Right now, I don't have my own law firm. I could open my own law firm, but I don't. And I don't because I vastly prefer a risk-free salary to a risky business ownership. That's because of my own life, my own choices, where I am financially. One of amongst the things, but one of the things that strikes me as deeply immoral about the system you're describing is, okay, you're streaming, you make some money streaming. Not everyone does. Most people who stream make no money. And the huge majority of streamers who are streaming and spending their time doing this will make nothing, right? Then someone becomes successful, and you're saying that after all the risk is broken out of the system, after we've gone from 100 people who stream, now we're in the 1% who are actually making any money doing it. Now that I hire somebody to put captions on my videos, I have to give them a percentage of my business now that it's successful. But they took none of the risk. They weren't there at the beginning when it was grinding and it wasn't working. So what you're doing is you're essentially you're letting people freeload on the risk taken in order to develop a successful business. And risk is a huge part of it. So back to my non-law firm, it is very possible, if I was starting a law firm, which is a fledgling enterprise, it may work, it may not work, that somebody would vastly prefer I pay them a salary than they assume the risk that my law firm fails, which, like most businesses, it might. In fact, it probably will mathematically. So just setting everything else aside, that strikes me as a deeply immoral part of your system. Or sorry, not.
Okay,
I want to make sure I get the terminology right. Not your model, which I understand is different, but
just like the ideal. I understand what you're saying. Yeah. So, but okay. So when I receive tax benefits, like when I receive the child tax credit, that comes from tax money that society at large takes no risk to assume, right? So when I tax you 30% of the income that you make from your business, the government's not taking any risk by taking 30% of your income. If anything, you could argue that that's more immoral because it's like a completely non-involved entity than someone that's actually at least working at the business, right? Obviously, people who work at businesses assume some level of risk because the business could close down and they have to find another job all of a sudden, right? But when I tax 30% of your income, I'm assuming no risk at all for that, right? I'm just taking 30% of your money. Fuck you if you have a problem with it. I'm the state. I'll literally throw you in fucking prison if you don't pay it, right? Like, I just don't understand under that framework.
I'm certainly not arguing in favor of higher taxes.
But what you're saying is your system at Conaboy is so substantially more immoral than our current system because, and you're just using the employee ownership as one example. Obviously, you understand my model has a bunch of different ways that you'd collectivize things, but just as that particular example, right? If we're saying it's so substantially more immoral to give your employee whatever 20% or a proportional say in how the business is managed, that's so substantially more immoral than the state with guns coming to you and saying, you better give me 30% of your income or I'm throwing you in prison. How is that? Like, it just doesn't seem like there's that big of a difference in the level of coercion or lack of freedom in that society versus the one that I describe.
Well, first of all, in the one you described, it would be both. There would be taxes and this thing, not one or the other. But beyond that, the fundamental issue there, amongst others, is that the people involved are not allowed to make these decisions for themselves. They are not allowed to own their labor, and they're not allowed to make decisions about how they alienate their labor. Like right now, as I said in my example, I prefer a salary to the risk of ownership. If I had to give up money for the risk of ownership and you had some kind of reasonable calculation for the percentages involved, I would prefer the money. That's where I am right now. I would rather not have the risk. In a few years, I might prefer to have the risk because my finances look different. But and that is a choice that I think it's good that people get to make, because most people do not want to assume the kind of risk that business ownership entails in the way that I think people look at like a Fortune 500 and they think that's what running a business is. That is not what running a business is. Most businesses are small and most businesses fail.
Well, let me ask you, I don't want to belabor the point. I feel like we need to move on to something else because we're at the risk of running in circles here. Why don't you argue against taxation then? Taxation fundamentally. Okay, so should we not have any taxes in society?
We should have the least amount possible.
But why shouldn't we have any taxes?
Because government is a necessary evil.
But why is it necessary? Actually, this does lead into what I wanted to transition the conversation to. Why is the government a necessary evil? What makes it necessary?
Because there are things that are public goods. There are things that cannot be done or will not be done in the private sector. I think, this isn't like a philosophical exercise. You can just look at history and see what those things are. You need somebody to negotiate trade deals with other nations. You need to maintain a military. These are things that must be done on a governmental level because they don't work on a private level. So yeah, there are absolutely things the federal government has to do. And if you read the Federalist Papers, whatnot, this is what they were debating. It's exactly what are the things we need a federal government for.
Yeah, but I'm not understanding. So, but you're just saying, okay, so are you basically saying the government needs to do certain things because if the government doesn't do those certain things, we have bad outcomes? Is it because without the government doing those certain things, our fundamental natural rights are more violated by the private market than by the public doing them? Like, what's the reason why the government needs to do certain things?
You don't even have a country. If you don't have borders, if you don't have a military, you don't get to be a country anymore because other countries invade you. Like that's
Right, but why is that bad? I'm just asking morally,
why is it
foundationally.
bad to be invaded?
Yeah, like what's the moral problem with what you're describing? I'm just asking you to flesh out your moral views here.
Okay, you think that you're asking me to justify morally why I think it would be bad to be invaded and conquered by a neighboring nation.
Yeah, I'm asking you about your. I think that's bad. I know that why. I know if you ask me, hey, morally speaking, Econoboy, why is it bad to be invaded? I'd have an answer for you. I'm asking you, what is your reason for saying not having a country being invaded? Why is that bad to you?
Because you want to have a just government that protects the rights of the people. If you do not have a government that is capable of doing that, you cannot protect those rights, and you are at the mercy of whatever the fuck the neighboring country thinks is the right thing to do.
Okay, and so okay, that's perfect. So I don't think that's quite as foundational as I was looking for, but at least that goes into what the point I was going to make is, right? Is that I think that in a number of ways, and I think in the law you see this as well. I think in a number of ways you can justify a social ownership ideal in regards to on balance of the other rights that you're able to experience. They are enhanced by a socialist ideal, right? That yeah, like you might not have the right to like start a private business, but let's just use a hypothetical, and maybe you would disagree with this hypothetical. Let's just say that we really don't understand the economy, right? We've fucked up in some way because goddamn, we just abolished private ownership and now we're all 10 times as rich as we used to be. I don't know what happened. Economics was wrong as a science. And it turns out the private ownership of the means of production was terrible for economic growth. And now we're 10 times richer a year later. Would you say that in that society, we are living in a more free society or a less free society, even though we don't have the right to start a business, but we're 10 times richer?
Less, but this is going to play into what I think will likely be an axiomatic difference in our worldviews. But when you talk to a socialist, and I haven't talked to you about this, so I'm lumping you in. You can correct me if I'm wrong. They tend to conflate positive rights with negative rights, which is actually fairly common in places like Europe, for example. So like they'll say something like the right to food or the right to healthcare or that sort of thing, as they'll frame it as a right as opposed to a policy. And when I'm talking about rights, I'm specifically talking about negative rights. So the things that you're describing they would be wonderful. They would be wonderful outcomes, but they're not in my mind rights. So it wouldn't actually much impact the analysis.
Okay, yeah. So, yeah, we might have an axiomatic different worldview. I think that if someone has 10 times the money, they are in a very meaningful sense more free than they used to be. For instance, if you just took me, and you just multiplied the amount of money that my net worth was multiplied by 10. Well, if that happened, I probably wouldn't have to work anymore. I could do whatever I wanted with my free time. My kids would have full college accounts. I'd be able to do substantially, I'd be able to act much more on my own instincts than I otherwise am able to do because I'm constrained by the amount of money that I have, right? That there's there's a reason why we would say that there's a difference between some paper access to a right and a meaningful, actionable access to that right. Like you can say that you have access, anybody, you can go out and buy health insurance if you can afford it. But similar to how MLK said the same thing, he said, hey, what's the point of having a right to sit at a diner if I can't afford a fucking sandwich? He didn't say fucking, obviously. But, I'm just saying that there's a meaningful difference between, yeah, you can sit at a diner if you want, but actually being able to meaningfully access the fruits of that diner, that's a meaningful difference in the amount of freedom that you have in a society. So the last thing I was going to say, sorry, I know I've been going on for a second here, is I think that in a number of ways, the socialist ideal leads to a society where people are in what I would call in a meaningful way, more free and able to enact their desires onto the world than in a society where we have essentially the private ownership of production.
So the reason that I don't consider those things rights is that when you create a right...
Well, I'm not asking if you consider it a right. Do you consider it more freedom? That's what I'm really concerned about.
I think that what's happening is that we're using a term that is a little bit ambiguous and ill-defined. I don't think it increases your legal freedoms. It doesn't change what you are allowed or not allowed to do under law. It changes the quality of your life, and it provides you with different opportunities. But I suspect that what we're doing is using freedom in two meaningfully different senses of the word.
Well, how do you define freedom? I would say freedom is the ability to enact your desires into the world, right? That like you're free when you have a meaningful ability to enact your desires.
No, I see. I would call that capacity, right? Like, I don't think Elon Musk has more freedom of speech than me, but Elon Musk has substantially more capacity to be heard than me. So like we're not. He's not more free than I am. He has more capacity than I do.
Well, but he is more free in many different. I don't know about the freedom of speech, obviously, but like Elon Musk can do whatever he wants with his free time. He's completely unconstrained with what he can do with his free time. You have to go to work every day. So in that way, Elon Musk is meaningfully more free than you, because you and I have to work every day. Elon Musk can do whatever he wants, and he can do whatever he wants because he has more money.
Elon Musk has a number of capacities that I don't have due to his money and resources. But the constraints that you're speaking of are what I would consider constraints of the state of nature. Like life requires that you find food. Life requires that you do all kinds of things. Nature constrains your actions. That is what it does, unless you find ways to stop it from doing so. But when I'm talking about freedom, I'm specifically talking about freedom from the government, is basically what I'm referring to. And when you're talking about freedom, you're talking about it in a sense of, am I able to do what I want to do this Tuesday, which is, I think, a meaningfully different sense of the word.
Well, it's obviously a meaningfully different sense of the word, but I mean, this is ultimately a battle of intuitions here. I'll leave it to our respective audiences to decide what's a more kind of holistic understanding of the word freedom. I would just say that yes, like in some senses, I'm not more unfree than Elon Musk. Like we both have to eat. We both have calories that we need. And if I'm bigger boned than him, maybe, I guess you could say maybe I need more calories than he does or whatever. But, fundamentally, there are some senses where every human being is equally unfree, right? But there's also other senses where every human being is certainly not equally unfree or equally free. That like a slave isn't equally free as someone who's not a slave. Like even if we had like a legal, mechanism by which, even if you sold yourself into slavery, I think you could say, well, you're still not free just because you made the positive choice to sell yourself into slavery. And similarly, if somebody is, let's say, helicoptered into the desert versus somebody helicoptered into like an urban environment, we wouldn't say that they both have the same amount of freedom, because the person who's helicoptered into the desert is meaningfully more fucked than somebody helicoptered into an urban environment, right?
So I think that, well, actually, let me see if I can maybe back this out in a helpful way. When you're talking about freedom, you're talking about like your ability to enact do whatever you want in the world.
Do what
you want.
Yeah. So that turns into almost a utilitarian analysis of like, is this going to work or is this not going to work? Right? Like I have a policy. We are more free if it works and your quality of life improves. You are less free if it doesn't. And that's basically the analysis.
Yeah, sorry. Well, I don't think that's the analysis. No, the analysis is just, can you do what you want? So it's not necessarily utilitarian. You could do things that are bad for you, right? So, I mean, you could go and be a gambling addict and destroy your life, right?
I'm from a government policy perspective. Like, for example, like the reason I brought up freedom of speech earlier, if we, let's say, hypothetically, I get on your worldview, like your moral frame, if we dramatically restricted freedom of speech in some way, but then we did the utilitarian math and, we restricted freedom of speech last week. It's been a week. It turns out life is measurably better. That would be then good in your mind because life is measurably better, even though freedom of speech has been restricted.
Well, it's a matter of holistically what you think of as freedom. So, for instance, if you were to say like, oh, well, it's like a more meaningful freedom is, let's say, your access to material goods, right? So if you were to say, oh, like by banning free speech, your access to material goods has skyrocketed by 100 times, maybe you would say like, yeah, what's the big deal about free speech? Everyone's 100 times richer. And, I'm essentially prioritizing the freedom to eat and live and buy a house over the freedom to speak, right? So obviously you can have, I was just going to say, Right. So I was just going to say, like, obviously you can have different prioritizations in terms of your freedom, but what I'm making is a much more kind of narrow argument of, if people have more money and access to wealth, that in many assorted meaningful ways, all else equal, right? All else equal, makes them substantially more free.
So, and what I'm getting at is that this is it's built on, I'm not saying it's like you're making a utilitarian argument. It's built on a utilitarian chassis, if that makes sense, where there's this idea that if your material living conditions improve, you are more free. and we could weigh that against a reduction in what we would consider natural rights.
But that's really not what I'm saying. Just one more time. So I'm not saying when your material condition improves, you necessarily have more freedom, because you can make the argument that drug addicts, if they get more money, they're less free because they're delving into addiction or whatever like that. However, what I am saying is that in our current in society, your access to material resources simply necessarily means that you have more freedom of choice and freedom to do what you want. So it's not about whether or not your life is improved by money. It's more about, if you have money, you have many more choices that are meaningfully given to you.
So if you had a magic wand, and if you did it, if you wave the wand, everybody in the country is materially wealthy to an extraordinary degree, and they have all the kinds of freedom that you're talking about.
Sure.
But Christianity and Islam are now banned by force of law. Is that a wand you're waving?
Well, so I just have to make a point here, and I'll answer your question directly. So again, I'm not making a comment about how I would prioritize certain freedoms. I'm making the all else equal. If people have more access to material resources, they are more free. Now, what you said is, would you prioritize the freedom associated with access to material resources over the freedom to practice your own religion? Totally different question. Now, I'll answer your question directly. I would say personally, no, I would not prioritize access to material resources over the ability to basically practice freely whatever religion you want. But you're not addressing my fundamental point, and I directly answered your question, so I'd love a direct answer to mine. If people, all else equal, if people have more access to material resources, they are, all else equal, much more free than if they didn't. For instance, I'll just use a crude example. If somebody has $1,000 in their bank account versus someone who has $10 million in their bank account, and let's say that's the entirety of their net worth, the person worth $10 million is much more free than the person worth $1,000.
No, well, in the way that I use the terms, they do not have more freedom; they have more capacity. That might not be a distinction that you agree with, but that would be how I use the terms.
Well, let's just say, do you think capacity is the way that you say capacity? Do you think capacity is important to maximize in a society?
Yes, but less so than freedom.
Okay. Well, then,
so, this is why I brought up the religion example. I'm not a utilitarian, but if I was going to adopt a utilitarian chasis for this moment, one way to look at something like freedom of religion or freedom of speech is to say, through the bloody arc of history, we have figured out that no matter how tempting it might look to abridge this right, no matter how great the outcome seems, one of the problems with utilitarianism is the problem of measurement. You never know when to stop measuring. Like, how do we know how far in the future to look? And one of the things we've learned is that when you restrict these freedoms, it goes badly. It might not go badly tomorrow. It might not go badly a year from now, but in the long term, it goes very, very badly. So as a heuristic, you can look at these natural rights and say, when someone is trying to restrict them, this is going to lead to negative outcomes, even if it looks like it leads to a positive outcome in the very short term. And again, I'm not a utilitarian, but that would be the way, if I were, that I would look at natural rights and say, well, this is something that we need to bring into the equation because we're very limited. And in your hypo, everything worked out and everyone's very rich, but we actually don't know how everything plays out. We never do. So we have to kind of use the heuristics we have. And one of the hard-won heuristics are these core rights.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, so number one, I think I would disagree with some of the things that you're saying, because I think that, let's just I'll use your word, capacity, right? That people have a greatly expanded capacity when the government involves itself in, I think, many different areas of life. I don't even know that you would necessarily disagree with that. You even said that, oh, well, a necessary evil, the government needs to redistribute some money from some people to other people with disabilities, the elderly, children, people like this. We need essentially a social safety net, right? And that, I think, is an expansion of their capacities, right? Amartya Sen would maybe agree with exactly how you're framing this with his capabilities approach. But so I don't know that I would necessarily disagree with that. But I would say that when we look at the arc of many of these different democratic socialist experiments, right? That when I love to use Norway as an example, as you probably know. When we look at Norway, for instance, in Norway, they're a very rich society. They're oil rich, obviously, but what they did with their oil wealth was they essentially socialized it, right? It's a collectively owned institution. They take all the gains from oil and they spend it on things that are a social purpose, public transit, the pension system, welfare for people who need it, things like that. And that in that sense, by socializing at least that aspect of their economy, they've made their citizens substantially more free, I would say, but they've given their citizens substantially more capacity to do what they want with their free time. And I think that that's a project by which the state and sort of collective democratic institutions should engage in. And engaging in that process, in Norway, I guess you're not able to open a Norwegian oil company, right? Because they've limited your right to do that. They've collectivized the oil wealth in their nation. I wouldn't say that the government's done an immoral thing by doing that, because on balance, they've greatly increased their capacity of their citizens to do with the world as they see fit.
But I mean, the thing about this is, and this might be a segue into your model, which I would totally concede is meaningfully different than the ideal. Like, Norway is in no way the socialist ideal. It's just completely different than that.
But can we at least say, Ryan, that they've engaged in a process of socialization, and we can see how, at least in that incremental step, they've made their citizens have substantially more capacity than they did before.
Well, I mean, the thing about that is, if you're going to make that argument, then the argument would be for example, like UBI. Like, there are many ways you could increase the capacity of people who are downtrodden or have bad luck or just sort of born into bad circumstances, or whatever different ways you want to phrase the way that people end up in bad situations, that don't require removing property rights from the entire populace. So, if that's the goal, if the goal is just to increase people's capacity, why not do that? Why not, come up with a UBI with a good funding mechanism? Because that's essentially what we're talking about.
Well, but it's fundamentally a case of redistribution, right? So it's like to fund a UBI such that people had their basic standard of living met. I think I estimated like $24,000, $2,000 a month UBI would cost something like $6 trillion. So you'd have to claw back that money somehow, right? So I don't find that there's a meaningful difference between, like, the government owns whatever. Let's say. Well, I was just going to.
Why does that have to be $2,000? I'm saying, like, when people.
You talked about standard of living, right?
When people talk about privatizing Social Security, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about, let's find a funding mechanism that works better, right? Rather than just a tax and spend model. Let's put the federal money into something that takes risks and develops return. Therefore, we can fund it, right? So, I mean, I think that what the difference between saying we want to have a good funding mechanism for societal benefit versus we want to have sweeping socialism is night and day. These are completely different things.
Well, but number one, I would make the argument that public wealth, the accumulation of public wealth, is actually a very good funding mechanism, right? Now, if you wanted to say, okay, well, sure, maybe because I could ask the hypothetical of, like, what if the best funding mechanism was capital income from public wealth? You would still say, well, we still shouldn't, obviously socialize all wealth in society. You would say there's probably different reasons to not do that. And so I don't want to get.
Your model is better than the socialist ideal, because your model allows for private property ownership and allows for private businesses. So it's better in that sense.
Well, it's right, but it's not better in some empirical sense, right? Because I could hypothetically, because you already said if people were 10 times richer, if we abolish private property.
It's morally better.
Right. It's morally better, right?
Morally better.
Yeah. Right, and so we have, might have.
Sorry. Morally better, asterisks, and then we're going to circle back to that, I'm sure, in a few minutes.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know how much there is to talk about, but. And to the audience, I guess, like, it's up to people how they would derive this kind of thing. But I would say, personally speaking, I think, because you said no to the original hypothetical of, hey, if people were 10 times richer, then I would still be against abolishing private property, because I believe in, some sense, like, it is just such a foundational natural right to open up a private business.
It's a moral obligation.
Well, it's not an obligation to open up a private business, but it's it's a foundational natural right that you should be able to open a business if you want. And so I would just say that, look, I would just say that, look, I don't, for me personally, I just don't find that to be that meaningful, right? That if I could imagine a society that's 10 times wealthier, that people have 10 times the capacity to do with what they want than they do now, that society is a society that I would describe as having many more freedoms than we do now. Of course, in some narrow sense, they're less free to open up a business if they want, but they're more free to do literally everything else combined, right? And so
the problem with those kind of thought experiments is it's like what we all want is a just government, right? That's what we all want. So if I say if we say if we're just going to make up things, it's like, well, what if we had a benign king? We have no laws. It's just his will. He does whatever he wants to do, but he's infallible and everything works out all the time. So, therefore, this would be a wonderful monarchy and we'd all be better off.
But I already conceded that I'm making a prioritization.
The problem with that is we know it doesn't work. We know it doesn't work because these kind of like utopian thought experiments, they run afoul of the lessons we've learned in history. So when I look at like our founders saying these are inalienable rights, I'm not looking at it and saying like, oh my goodness, what a clever idea this person came up with on this day when Thomas Jefferson wrote this down. I'm looking at like, this is what the best and wisest minds of the founding time, after months of deliberation, decided were foundational to our country, were foundational to a just government, based off of their analysis of all the governments in the world, and this is more the Constitution than the Declaration at this point, and the time to deliberate and think about it and come up with the things that are essentially the thou shalt nots of avoiding a tyrannical government. So those are not lines I think we should cross lightly. I think that as we progress as a society, we need to be extraordinarily careful not to accidentally tear down the foundation. We need to build on the foundation instead.
Well, so again, number one, just to be clear, like I think that when you look into the history of like Madison and Jefferson and what they thought about private property rights, like these were people who had a very hierarchical view. Obviously, in some sense, you could call Jefferson an egalitarian in the sense that he wasn't a monarchist and things like that. But these are people that had a very hierarchical view. They believed in what you might call recognizably superior people, and that those people should be essentially the brunt force of determining what does and does not happen in society. And I'm not trying to, but obviously we would agree that like these people had wild ideas when it came to what freedoms people should have. Jefferson owned slaves. He believed in Jeffersonian democracy, where essentially everyone was a small business owner. He didn't believe in this sort of like huge wealth and capital accumulation as well. These guys had totally idiosyncratic views to what we would describe as like ordinary freedoms today. These are people that didn't believe that everybody should have the right to vote, that it should be, property owning males and things like this. So I just don't know to what extent we can really use the founders as in totality. And you would agree with this, obviously, that, in totality, a reference point. But I feel like we're kind of skipping between the sort of practical and the ideal, right? Because I used a practical example where, hey, at least like incrementally, it seems like a state like Norway socialized a big part of their industry. I think something like 40 to 45% of the GDP of the country comes from socially owned institutions. And we see that society is still a very rich society. They still have a lot of disposable income. We see that comparable to even Americans, they have high levels of consumption. And I would say that all else equal, they, by engaging in that process of socialization, have done a service to their citizens. And if we're going to say like, oh well, it seems like, because what you said earlier was, it seems like we know that doesn't work. It's like, well, it does seem to be working, at least as a process in these countries. Although of course they haven't achieved the full ideal that I'm describing.
The thing about, and this is why I brought up like the perfectly just king. The thing about a really powerful state that can do nearly anything, and hopefully we would agree, if the state, like in China, owns 65, 70% of the economy, I don't know what the exact figure is, but they own a huge percentage of it, that the state essentially has control over almost every aspect of daily life through that mechanism, if they choose to wield it that way. When the state has that kind of power, the only way that leads to just outcomes is when the people are fairly homogenous in what they want, right? Like imagine today, we in America had 20 or 40 or 35, I'm not sure what the number is, but people can look it up, percent of our economy was controlled directly or indirectly by the state. And Donald Trump is the president. How do you think that would go? How's it going? How's it going for Columbia and Harvard with a tiny fraction of the money on the line? Like, it becomes a problem because when people have very different views, as we do in this country, about what is good and what is moral, when you give the state that level of power, the risk of the tyranny of the majority becomes really strong.
Yeah, so I'll make a couple of arguments, right? So number one, America does not have a majoritarian democracy, right? So I would say in a number of ways, our democracy is woefully incomplete from the democratic ideal, and I would make a lot of reforms in that regard. Number two, I think there's a lot of evidence that when it comes to reining in state power and when it comes to extending liberties to people, there's a lot of evidence that democracy essentially solves this. That when I compare the freedom of a country like in Norway, for instance, where Norway has a higher level of socialization, both in terms of percentage of wealth and in terms of the GDP that they produce, than China does, right? They have more socialization of the economy in Norway than in China. But when I look at the freedoms in either of those societies, I would say, well, fucking by almost every conceivable metric, Norwegians are more free than Chinese people. And of course, that's because democracy is real, that democracy really does rein in the excesses of government. That's my first point. My second point is that I had a second point, but I lost it for a second. My second point was going to be about the reining in of my second point was going to be that if I were to look at what are the scariest powers to give the government, I would say, hey, having a portfolio of public wealth that you manage, which the government already has, by the way, I'm just advocating for increasing the amount that they manage, essentially. Having a portfolio that the public manages through its government is way less scary than giving the government the power to arrest you, put you on trial, control the nuclear weapons, control the military, control the police state. The government has the power to arrest you, determine why it arrests you, throw you in prison, and nuclear bomb other countries. To me, if we're really scared about the government being involved in, the commanding heights or the most scary things in society, I don't think a public wealth portfolio is the scariest part. I think the nuclear weapons are much scarier.
Oh, I think that would be a mistake to think that.
Really? Okay.
Well, can I ask you a clarifying question about your model, because it wasn't totally clear to me?
Sure.
You were suggesting kind of like a constellation of holding companies, which would be right. So I had two questions I wasn't sure of, and it would just be helpful if you could clarify. The shares of those companies are owned by the government, correct?
Well, it would be a mixture. Yeah. So it would be a mixture. So I think those companies themselves should be able to go public. So ultimately some proportion would be owned directly by the public, but of the public shares that are traded from the holding corporation, some of them would be owned by the other holding corporations, and some of them would be owned by private investors. But I'll concede and say at least a portion of their shares would be directly owned by the public, and then maybe at the very least probably a majority of their shares would be owned either by the public holding corporations or the public directly.
But when you say the public, that's actually the ambiguity I'm trying to clarify. Like, are
the
they
government,
owned,
the state,
the government? So they'd be owned by the federal, and it would be at least 51% would be owned by the federal government.
Well, it not necessarily, right? Because a holding corporation could list 70% of its shares, and now a majority of the holding corporation is owned by the other holding corporations, institutional investors, retail investors, that kind of mixture of investors as well.
I assume you would not risk a Vanguard or a BlackRock seizing control of one of these corporations through M&A or a stock acquisition.
No, I'd be okay with that.
Okay, so in your system, the government could invest in these things and then could sell them, so they would no longer be controlled by the public.
Yeah, if a holding corporation decided that it would be the most economically efficient thing to essentially sell 70% of the shares to the various investors available, then the public would be a minority owner, but the public would also get a whole truckload of cash when those shares are actually sold on the market. So, it's just an entrepreneurial decision by the manager of the holding corporation.
Yeah, and we'll get to that. And then the other question I have is, you describe these as holding corporations. In my line of work, holding corporations typically own a controlling interest in the companies they hold rather than a passive interest. Like when you look at like Vanguard, these aren't holding companies. Vanguard has passive stakes in a lot of businesses, but they don't own controlling shares in the businesses. How did you mean holding company? Did you mean?
It just depends. I mean, if you look at Temasek, like Temasek in Singapore does own controlling stakes and a lot of its portfolio. So that's not totally true what you're describing. And then with regards to the holding corporations that I'm talking about, it would be entrepreneurially allocated capital. So I'm sure that their portfolio would be, in part, it would be like, oh, I only own 3% of Apple, 1% of Amazon. But then a lot of the, they might make, like, say, development activities. They say, oh, part of what we're going to do is we're going to form a holding corporation ourselves to build like renewable energy development, and we would own a majority of those developments directly. So it's all essentially managed by the professional investors of the fund.
So the way I look at government powers is it acceptable if this power is then given to somebody I really disagree with politically?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, my concern, and the reason why this kind of like gigantic control through financial mechanisms of the economy would be concerning to me, is that you would then have a situation where whichever agency these companies ultimately reported to, and they would have to report to some agency, I would assume, would then have the power to dictate policy to them. And agencies report to the president. So you're one bad president away from sweeping change throughout the entire country, not on the basis of legislation or bicameralism or limited government, but just on whim.
So I would really disagree with this. So you didn't respond to and I'll of course give you the chance to. My first point was that I think democracy checks the power of the state much more than just like limiting the kinds of things that the state is involved in. And I compared China to Norway. But to respond to your point, which was more of a response to my second point, I am much more scared at the concept of Donald Trump being in charge of the police apparatus and nuclear weapons than I would be scared of the concept of the Donald Trump being the president when we had a portfolio of public wealth in the country. I'll use this as a direct example. When Trump took office, you saw some people talk about this, but I think for the bulk of the fear of Donald Trump was about his powers to change U.S. military policy, his powers to change the policies related to the police apparatus under the federal government's purview. And you saw some people say, I'm also scared about what he's going to do to the Federal Reserve. Now, the Federal Reserve as an economic institution can literally print as much money as it wants. It sets the interest rates of our society. It can, to a large extent, enforce the banking regulations that we decide. So our whole financial system, in large part, a big focal point is the Federal Reserve. Some people were scared about what he would do to the Federal Reserve, but I think the bulk of the fear, and I think this is very rational, came from the president's interaction with the police state and federal regulatory institutions, not from some transitive economic power that the president has.
Well, but the Federal Reserve, the reason people aren't concerned about it is the Federal Reserve has essentially been grandfathered in by the Supreme Court as the one agency that the Supreme Court seems to be willing to defend against an executive that wants to change.
I would argue for a similarly independent structure for these holding corporations.
Yeah. And I'm saying that you won't have it absent a constitutional amendment.
Let's just say that we have it.
Okay.
Because again, we're trying to
have the benign king. What I'm saying is practically. Right now we're talking practically. I'm saying if you look at Celia Law, if you look at Waxer v. Trump, the court has basically maybe Wexler. Sorry if I got that wrong. The court has basically said that they're fencing off the Federal Reserve, but they're not extending that logic to new agencies. So just to be clear, I wouldn't make a practical objection to the philosopher king.
I would make a principled objection to the philosopher king. So it wasn't clear to me that we switched to the practical. If we're fully switching to the practical, I would just say that, look, I think that the way that you establish your model really, really does matter. At the very least, there's a lot more trade-offs with the potential model. But I would say it's to me at least, it's very clear to me that we do have the ability to establish similar institutional frameworks to the Federal Reserve. Because what the Supreme Court, if I recall their ruling, said about the Federal Reserve was because of the history of its institutional structure, right? And you could absolutely form an institutional structure identical to the Federal Reserve, but just give that institution a slightly different purpose. Instead of going out and buying, like the Federal Reserve has the power and does enact that power to buy trillions of dollars of financial assets. I'm just saying, okay, well, let's just, spin off a direct analogy to that and do the exact same thing, right? So I think it's actually highly practical if you really think about it.
I'll grant you that this is a hyper-practical objection. Like with the current Supreme Court, I would bet all the money in my pocket against all the money in your pocket. It's a hypothetical, so we're never going to get to resolve it. That if that agency was created tomorrow, this court would say the president had the ability to fire the heads of that agency.
But I think, I think, and you can be right. Yeah, you could be right. You could be right. But I'm just saying that at the very least, what the Supreme Court said was that it's because of the history of the institutional structure, right? Yeah. And so if we just copy and pasted that structure, but gave it, because the Federal Reserve has sweeping economic power in this country. It's probably the single most powerful agency when it comes to our economy. Again, can print as much money as it wants, right? Like
it's crazy, and there's
and you probably disagree with that, but I'm just saying that like the idea that like, oh, we couldn't form essentially a holding corporation to go out and buy public stock, or we couldn't make this like maybe an agency of the Federal Reserve or something. Like, I don't know, I just don't think it would be that impractical to do, but that's a very practical objection anyway. Yeah. I'm curious about your response. Yeah, go on. Sorry.
We don't need to get in the weeds on that practicality, but what I would say is that your view of the government, I think, is when you say like an imperfect democracy. When you read the Federalist Papers, when you read what the founders were thinking about, their biggest concern oftentimes was faction capture and the tyranny of the majority. Like if your opinions are popular and well within the majority's view, you don't need freedom of speech. If you practice the dominant religion in your society, you don't need freedom of religion. Like the rights are best understood as limitations on democracy. We're saying you can't take away people's right to practice their religion, even if it's very unpopular. It's a thing you cannot do with your democratic power, right?
So I'm not saying that we shouldn't have like federal rights or national rights in some sense, right? But what I am saying is that when we look at more democratic countries than America, in Norway, you have freedom of speech in Norway. Like in Norway, you have a police state just like we do here. In Norway, you have a whole sort of different set of liberal freedoms that we have there. When I go to Norway, I'm not afraid to speak my mind or to interact with the public or go to a protest or vote for who I want, right? And they have a more majoritarian system. So empirically speaking, the founders were just straight up incorrect about the implications of more democratic frameworks at the very least, because we can see more democratic frameworks and what they do, and they do a pretty good job at protecting people's individual rights.
I think that you are mistaken in using Norway as your bellwether in this. Sorry, was it bellwether?
Well, I mean, you can Australia, New Zealand, the UK, all of these different majoritarian systems.
You can look at them, but what's happening in the UK is that freedom of speech is rapidly shrinking and becoming a small and withered thing, and we'll see how that goes. What happens in Norway is that they have an incredible amount of homogeneity. So like there is just less diversity of opinion and just less blood sporty politic than we have.
They have more parties than us. They have a much more robust system of parties and political differentiation than we do. In Finland, they have very similar structures. They had a civil war.
What are the demographics of Norway?
What do you mean? What are the demographics? They have different ethnic groups, and I don't know.
Do they look nearly as diverse as our demographics?
Well, what are you talking about? We can look at other countries that are highly diverse and more majoritarian, right?
Yeah. You're lauding Norway, so I'm talking about Norway. Like they have a much more homogeneous society. They have much more the similar beliefs about what society should be doing.
They don't.
And by the way, they have the part of the way that they've kept this, for example, is that they massively incentivize citizens to have children while denying migrants during the migrant crisis. So what they were doing was that they were keeping their society kind of in a box in terms of, who's there and who's not
They
there.
let in thousands and thousands of immigrants. So did Sweden. Had an immigration flow something like 2% of their population or something.
I'm not talking about Sweden. I'm talking about
Well,
Norway.
No. We're not talking. No. We're not talking about Norway, right? What you brought up.
Talking about Norway.
No. Norway is just one example, right? But what you said is, like the reason why majoritarian democracy works.
Using that example, I'm saying this is why this might be okay in Norway not here.
My point is, there's all kinds of, like, to a huge degree, like radical exceptions to all of these little things that people come up with. Oh, like those societies only work because they're homogenous. It's like, okay, well, if we look at Finland, for instance, which is all like white people, quote unquote, it's like, well, they had a civil war closer to the modern era than we did. They had a civil war. They all fucking tried to kill each other, right? Like, I don't think that that's in some sense like, oh, a totally homogenous society without any different groups. Oh, they're politically more homogenous. They agree on more shit. They have more parties and a more robust parliamentary debate than we do. We only have 2 parties compared to their like 10 or 20 parties that they have. I don't think that there's political homogeneity in these countries. They have conservative governments, liberal governments, socialist governments. Like, there's just no sense in saying like, oh, like it's necessarily the case that these countries are homogenous in some like meaningful sense. And that's why they can have their majoritarian democracies.
Far more than ours. And I think that first of all, these countries don't have anything approaching your ideal system. They have a small, tiny fraction of it at most.
45%? I mean, 45% of the way there? That seems, I don't know, you're doing pretty well in terms of your progress, I would say.
I think that there is a vast difference in saying that one sector, which I still wouldn't love, but one sector, which happens to be a large percentage because that's just the way Norway is built with all its oil, which is, again, sui generis, we can then extrapolate from that and say if all sectors were done that way, that we would not have the same creeping problems. And I think that it's interesting to have this conversation in a moment where we've seen exactly how much the president can do with control over a tiny trickle of money in comparison to universities. When you give like the president or you give the federal government control over these mechanisms, and by giving them ownership, you are giving them control. You're just hoping that there are going to be barriers between that control that hold, which is why so much of your article is about the creation of those barriers. But those barriers are not as good a protection as just not giving them the power in the first place.
But Ryan,
which is why you have a limited government.
You haven't answered my fundamental criticism, which is I could say the same thing about nuclear weapons. That's a wild power to give Donald Trump.
Because it's one we have to have.
Why?
Have to.
There's a lot of countries without nukes.
You have to be you have to have a military.
You don't have to have nukes.
You have to have.
You don't have to have nukes. Many countries don't have nukes.
That like hyper specific. We don't have to have nukes. Do we have to have airplanes?
We're being specific. No, really quick, Brian.
Camouflage?
We're being specific. You're saying we're giving the government the power over managing public wealth, and I would obviously in my society,
is a power that any government has to have. It is a power that any functioning government has to have.
I'm not talking about. Clearly, you don't need private businesses to at least have a government, right? North Korea doesn't have private businesses, but they have a government. I would just say that, hey, it's a way worse fucking government because they don't have some sort of like private capital accumulation, right? But forget about that for a second. We're talking about the power to have nuclear weapons and the police state and the military, right? Now, I feel like what you ultimately are going to say is, well, we have to give the government that power because in a meaningful sense, my values are offended by the idea of having private institutions be in charge of all these things, right? But you're making this kind of like, oh, like it's super extra dangerous to have the government be in charge of businesses. No. But what I would really quick, I was just going to say, what I would say is it's pretty fucking, to me, way more dangerous to give if you're so skeptical of the government using its power maliciously, it's way more dangerous to give the government nuclear weapons than the power over a holding corporation.
It's because defense has, this is not that they didn't have these terms back when they were writing, but defense has a collective action problem. You like when you have individual states who are all attempting to figure out their militias, and each one has to marshal its own army, then a country that has a concentrated military will just be able to conquer you before you get your shit together because it's not something that works when it's decentralized. Most things do work when they're decentralized. So when you have something that does work like decentralized, for example, property rights, it is better to have it decentralized. But there are certain things that must be decentralized because you just don't get to be a country if you don't have that. If you don't centralize border policy, you don't have a border policy. If you don't centralize military, you don't get to be a country anymore. These are things that must be done centrally. That's not a question of whether or not I'm afraid of military power. It's a question of what powers we must give because they're a necessary evil, as I said earlier.
Right, but you're just essentially asserting, hey, for the various reasons that I have in my my moral framework, like you said, an anarcho-capitalist would say, well, you're just another flavor of socialist, Ryan, because you're talking about the government should have the ownership of the police state and all these different court systems, and I don't know, probably some other public options as well. But obviously, you're just saying, okay, on balance of my other values, it would be offensive to me that we would have privately produced military and privately produced, nuclear weapons and things like that. And I would say, okay, well, sure. But what I'm saying is that it's offensive to my set of values to have like complete private ownership of the means of production, because I think that in a number of ways, to loop back to our original conversation, people are meaningfully less free. To your extent, maybe you'd even agree, they'd have meaningfully less capacity to do what they want to do with their free time. And that's just something that I prioritize over your ability to start a business. And I said the crude example, your ability to start a private business, to me, if we could at least see that society is so much better in these other material ways, is not as important as people having substantially more capacity.
Well, but all you're really saying now is that when you do moral philosophy on a certain level, axioms are irreducible. And what I'm suggesting is that your axioms are un-American and immoral, right? So, of course, we disagree. That was the premise of the conversation.
Yeah.
So I'm unsurprised when you disagree. I'm saying that, my point is when, we read the Declaration of Independence and it says that all men are created equal and are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that didn't mean that they were all created with equal bank accounts. That didn't mean that they were all created in the same level of affluence. It's a moral statement about their worth and what the government should not do, not a question of what powers the government should be given. And what you're expressing is a desire for a state that would have, if it wanted to, control over, I think in your model, 90% of the economy. That strikes me as the first thing I would do if I was trying to create a totalitarian state. It would be amongst the first things.
Well, so the government already has control over 100% of the economy. They just, to your point, they don't have direct control. They do. The government could at any point say, we're going to collectivize everything.
Ownership. You don't think this is a meaningful distinction?
I do think it's meaningful, but I don't think it's fair to say that the government doesn't have control over the economy, because it absolutely does in every sense of the word. There was an interesting, under the enforcement rights, there's a Supreme Court case, which you might find, maybe you're familiar with it. It's called Shelley versus Kramer. And that precedent was later overturned. But what the Supreme Court at the time basically held was that what the Supreme Court held at the time was basically that the state cannot legally kick off a black family from living in a whites-only neighborhood, because the state is involved in essentially every aspect of our economy. So the state, by saying you're not allowed to live here because of a contract dispute, that's the state basically enforcing that this black family can't live there, which the state under the Constitution isn't able to do because of the 14th Amendment or whatever, right? And so I think that that's a very sensible way to look at how we actually regulate the economy. Now, obviously, to your point, is it a meaningfully large difference to say that, well, the state has direct ownership in the economy? Of course, I would say I am arguing for a massive change in how we do things, but I just I don't think it's fair to say the state doesn't have this huge level of control in the economy already. It already has a huge level of control in the economy, right? And that's why I use the example of nuclear weapons, that I think that, and this is ultimately a battle of intuitions. We'll just, however people kind of evaluate these things, that I think it's much more scary, the idea. However, I would agree that the government should be in charge of nuclear weapons, but it's much more scary to me, the idea that, oh, we just elected somebody crazy and now they're in charge of the nuclear arsenal, than, oh, we just elected somebody crazy and now they're in charge of the portfolio of public wealth in our society.
So if you remember when really one of the things that broke the world politically was Biden's mask mandate through OSHA which affected only companies that were 100 people plus nationally, right? And the reason it became such a big deal is that the government was, without legislative imprimatur, without bicameralism, seizing direct control of people's healthcare decisions through economic means, right? And that was a huge problem for a lot of people. And what you're seeing now with Trump and universities is not dissimilar, where he's seizing control or attempting to of university policy by pulling economic levers. That sort of lever is too strong. It invites tyrannical behavior. It is the sort of thing that eventually someone you don't like is going to pick up and wield, which is exactly what happened in the USSR. It's not that it's in some utopian version of reality theoretically impossible to have governments that honor these powers. It's that when you create too sweeping a government power, the bad guy shows up eventually because bad guys like power.
But Ryan, the thing that made the USSR a totalitarian hellscape wasn't the collective ownership of the means of production. It was the police state that the government was in charge of, right? Yeah. And so I would just say, well, fuck me. Like, if I want to avoid the totalitarianism of the Soviet Union, I would recommend at least one main thing. I would say, to the extent that we're going to give the state the power to throw us in prison, we damn sure better make sure that those powers are checked by a democratic populace that's engaged in elections, because that's the big difference between like the totalitarianism of the Soviet Union and the police state of, like, say, the UK at the same time. You know, you probably heard me argue about this, but like the UK elected a socialist government in 1945, right? That socialist government had the powers of the police state, the military. I don't think that the UK had nukes in 1945, but, you know, later on they would get nukes and elect other socialist governments that had the power of the nukes, right? And the reality is that they didn't do the totalitarianism of the Soviet Union, even though they engaged in collectivist policies. These things are fundamentally different. The totalitarianism that people are afraid of with the USSR and the state of China and stuff like that isn't because they have collective ownership of the means of production. It's because those are totalitarian governmental institutions, anti-democratic government institutions that have police powers. That's the scary thing about their societies. And when it comes to Donald Trump and electing a madman like him, again, it seems a lot more scary and totalitarian to me that he's blackbagging people and throwing people in unmarked cars, because that's a police state power, not an economic power. I mean, Donald Trump, for instance, recently he signed an executive order that said that basically he completely ended wind energy in this country in terms of building new wind energy, because he said, I'm not going to issue any federal permits, right, to the wind industry, right? Essentially completely shut down new construction in the wind industry. I would say that's pretty fucking crazy. I totally don't agree with that. But I would say that all of these different police apparatus things that Trump is in charge of is way scarier than his ability to control federal permits or control economic institutions in our country.
No, not at all. Because I mean, you know, if you can do it for wind, you know, then if you control every sector, you can do it for every sector.
On the USSR, do you agree that the scary part about
no. The reason that works, that he could do that for wind, is because there is a regulation that gives federal control over this. Now, obviously, if you follow this in my conversation, you know that I would prefer a much smaller federal government and probably am against that particular regulation. But once you give the state the power over something like that, they will eventually wield it. And when you propose 80-90% ownership of the economy, I hear that as wind regulations, but for everything, because they can do it in every sector, and they can do it without even passing a law. They can do it just by forcing the companies to enact it. Don't like wind? We'll just stop building wind turbines, because the government can just say no more wind turbines. It's not up to the market. It's up to the government. They'll just do it.
So do you agree that the scary part about the Soviet Union wasn't the collective ownership of the means of production, but rather it was the fact that they would send the police to kill you if they disagreed?
I think that is a scary part of the Soviet Union. I think that what fundamentally happened, I think what fundamentally happened in the Soviet Union is that they, and by they I mean the centralized authority, did not believe that that the rights I'm talking about were moral obligations. They didn't believe it. But once you don't believe that, then you can do all kinds of terrible things with state power.
Right. But again, we're making a relative case, right? So you're saying, well, but if you gave the government the power over these holding corporations and the heights of the economy through these holding institutions, that's like a really, really just like incredibly scary thing. But what I'm arguing is against the extremity of your language here. That I think it's way more scary to give a totalitarian government or an authoritarian government like Trump the power over the police apparatus and the military versus giving him the same power over a portfolio of financial wealth and the economy and things like that. Like that's way scary. And if I had to say like what are the top like 10 things that make the USSR a scary place to live, I don't even think if you asked regular people that. I don't think that regular people would say, the scary thing was that the government had a bunch of government-owned factories. They would say the police state, the lack of individual freedoms, the totalitarianism with regards to, the press and no democratic institutions. And I would say, here's what I would say is that that's a pretty fucking big deal. And that's why the society that I would advocate for would have all of those same freedoms. They just would have the collective ownership of the means of production as one thing on top. And that's not as scary as the idea that basically we would give the military we would give the state the complete control over the military and the nuclear weapons.
Once you believe that natural rights come from the government rather than belonging to the people, then you can pick and choose which of them you care about. And once you can do that, the state can do anything. It's just a question of finding a way. The moral issue with what you're proposing is that you are, and I think we agree on this, willing to infringe upon these core natural rights that our country was founded on because you think it would make things better. And maybe you're right, maybe you're not. What I'm saying is once you start down that road, you open the door to tyranny because the power that you are creating will eventually be wielded by somebody that you don't like very much. And the best check on that is just not to give them the power in the first place. I think we would be, and I'm a small government federalist. I think we would be much better off if the government did not have sweeping control over so many things that it currently does. But that's kind of just where we are in history. I don't know that we can walk all of that stuff back, but we certainly don't have to propose new sweeping powers that will intrude on day-to-day life across the country.
Yeah, and so all I'm saying is that if you really took seriously this, and this is kind of my fundamental point, I don't know that I have anything else to say here, is that if you really took seriously the idea that, oh my goodness, the fucking the government, when you give the government any power, that's a road towards tyranny, it's a terrible, terrible thing, then I would say you would take seriously the idea that the government has control over things like nuclear weapons. You would take seriously the idea that the government, the police state and all the things under Donald Trump, like you said, you wouldn't necessarily call Donald Trump immoral, and you said that was because Donald Trump's general... Well, I thought you kind of interchanged those two. Whatever, you wouldn't call him evil. You wouldn't call him evil because his general goal is not to do these kind of like anti-democratic, anti-liberal things. But I think that there's clearly a ton of general goals that Trump has that are totally totalitarian and authoritarian in nature. We've already discussed some of them. And that highest amongst those is not, for instance, he's proposed starting a sovereign wealth fund. That didn't even get news coverage that he proposed starting a sovereign wealth fund. But I don't
give a shit about starting a sovereign wealth fund.
But hold on. You do give a shit because starting a sovereign wealth fund means giving the president a huge amount of economic power over society, theoretically, right? The thing that people talk about when it comes to the scary tyranny that the government can do, and I'm making an intuitive argument, I think most people would agree with this, is not, the government's going to start a sovereign wealth fund and start socializing the means of production. It's the government's doing shit with the police state, the military, our individual freedoms. Those are so much more important than the collectivization of the means of production, and that's what I'm saying.
I asked you at the beginning of this when we started talking about your model, and the reason I asked you is about whether or not these companies would have controlling shares in companies. And the reason is that a passive investment is very different in terms of risks than a controlling investment. Your model, as far as you've articulated it to me and what I've read, would allow for the government to have controlling interests, therefore control over 90% of the economy. That they wouldn't need to legislate anything. They could just dictate what these companies do. They wouldn't need to pass a law to enforce a social policy. They would just say, the companies must do X because we own them and they are now obligated
They
to.
can already do that without ownership, though, Ryan. Like, again, every regulation is a mandate that a company do something they otherwise not do.
It requires a law.
Right, but just because, what are we talking about? So the government can pass a regulation that says, hey, companies, you have to do this. How is that meaningfully different than the government saying, I own something, and so now the company has to do this, right? The government still has the power to dictate whatever it wants to whatever company it wants. Look at the TikTok ban.
It's meaningfully different in a number of ways. One way in which it's meaningfully different is that it requires bicameralism and presentment, which actually is a check on federal power, which would be a useful thing that would be bypassed in this situation because you would have agency heads who could just dictate the policy, and if president doesn't like it, they'd probably just fire them. That's the practical objection we covered earlier. Another way in which it's different is that once the government has ownership in the economy in this way, you are now going to have a very serious conflict of interest across the board. You're going to have very serious conflicts of interest in terms of things like SEC enforcement. You're going to have very serious conflicts of interest in terms of how fundraising is done. It's going to create state favoritism in the system you've created, which would have all kinds of downstream economic consequences, which could be disastrous. But more importantly, it just reduces the barriers to entry. It gives the government frictionless control over the entire economy and through the economy, everybody's lives.
All right, well, I'll just, we've been going for 2 hours here. I'll make my final statement. I'll give you the last word. I think fundamentally, if we can sum up this conversation, I think we can say, look, we have very fundamental different views about morality, but then we also have very fundamental different views about the implications of government power. I think that those two things are very fair to say. And what I would say is this, is that, look, I think that to the extent that we think an inherent, unalienable right that people have is the ability to start a business, I would say, okay, fair enough. I guess my society doesn't have that. You don't have private ownership of the means of production. But I would make several statements at once. I would say that, look, I don't think, number one, you take your own values seriously because you don't advocate for getting rid of like all the billion different ways that the government, maybe you do, but it sounds like you have a lot of thresholds in your head, that you don't advocate for getting rid of all the billion different ways that the government has very, very direct control in the business and allocation process. And I think that as well, if we're really making the argument that, hey, it's like a really potentially scary thing that the government has control over these businesses directly, I would say, well, they already basically have that control. And then number two, to the extent that they don't, they have control over things that I would describe as way scarier than control over a bunch of different private businesses, things like nuclear weapons and this and that. I think that on the second point of the implications of the power of the government, I think that what makes countries like the USSR fascist, basically, totalitarian in nature, isn't the collective ownership of the means of production. I think that for the most part, the reason why they don't have individual freedoms and they don't have democracy in those countries is because, or they have anti-democratic measures in those countries, is because they don't have strong democratic institutions. Strong democratic institutions makes a world of difference. It's why I compared Norway to China. If you look at the individual freedoms that Norwegians have and compare them to Chinese people, and you look at the power over the economy, Norway as a proportion, the government in Norway has more power over the economy than China in terms of a percentage of wealth and the percentage of GDP that gets produced by state industries. Huge power in Norway, but Norwegian people are so much more free. And the last thing that I'll say as a general point, and then I'll give you the last word, go as long as you want, is that I think that my system makes people, and I'll use the word freedom because it's my closing statement, much more meaningfully free. That when people have much more actual material access to well-being because we've redistributed wealth and income in society to be much more egalitarian, they're much more meaningfully free to access healthcare, to do what they want with their free time, to abstain from working if they feel like they need to eat as much as they need to go on vacation if they want. I think all of those combined freedoms associated with having a much more egalitarian material existence are much more important than someone's individual right to open a private business. I hope all that makes sense, Ryan. It's been really great talking to you. Go as long as you want in your closing statement, and I'll sit here and listen.
Always a pleasure. Can I ask you a few questions? Just because I meant to ask you this, and we didn't get to it.
Yeah, sure.
Would this heuristic work for you? Like, because everyone endlessly argues about definitions in this space, and it's kind of tiresome. So I'm trying to come up with a heuristic that I think works. Capitalism is an economic model characterized by private ownership. Socialism is a model characterized by social or worker ownership, and communism is a model characterized by state ownership. Would that work for you?
I would agree with the first part, but I don't agree with communism as a state ownership. My system is technically state ownership. I would call it socialism. I think communism is a classless, stateless society as described by Marx, essentially.
Yeah, but as an economic model, who owns things?
Well, in communism, the ownership of society would be collective, but not necessarily state because it's a stateless society.
Yeah, so I think that what you see in practice is what was described by Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag Archipelago, which is that there are some really beautiful ideals that you can write down on paper and maybe express, and maybe you convince somebody about them, that will sound lovely about a classless, stateless society, that'll sound lovely about making things better, and don't we just care about everybody. But the way to safeguard freedom in the meaningful sense of the word is to preclude the state from taking it from you. And the only way to do that is to limit the state's powers. And this is why the core American values that we were founded on and are in our founding documents are all about these unalienable rights that we are vested in, not freedoms in the way that Econoboy is talking about in terms of the freedom to get a sandwich because you wanted a sandwich on Tuesday, but the core God-given freedoms that make you an individual and that no just government could take from you. And when people propose making the government bigger, making it more powerful, intruding into your lives in new ways, and they say, of course it's going to work out, the American response is suspicion. And in this way, we are different than Europeans. I have European family, I have European friends, I spend a lot of time in Europe. In Europe, they trust their government and they are afraid of their corporations. And in America, we're the opposite. We have a lot of trust in the private sector and a lot less trust in our government. And that is healthy. It is an American morality. And when we stray from that, when we start proposing a new and sweeping government model, it should make Americans feel a sense of unease. It should feel like a moral imposition. It should trigger your moral sensibilities, and it should fucking bother you. And when this happens, people should speak out against it. And I hope to God they will. You're a very nice guy, Econoboy. You're a smart guy. I really enjoy talking to you. I hope we can do it again. And when I said on X that you were in the best case a useful idiot for actual villains, I meant that. I didn't mean that you're the villain. It's just that the thing that you are describing is the thing the next villain will pick up and use as a sword. But I hope we can do it again sometime. I enjoy your company.
All right. Talk to you later, bud. See ya. Well, there she was, guys. Ryan, your time has come. Okay. I thought it was a pretty good discussion. I saw some people. Oh, why is it all? Oh, I know why it's high. I know why it's high. 1 second. There we go. Yeah, I people were saying like, oh, talk about like where does he get natural rights from? I didn't really want to delve into a meta-ethical discussion, right, like that, because I think that's I don't know. I didn't think that would be as satisfying a conversation, but and it was funny because I also moved off the Lockean thing as quickly as I could because it seemed like he was willing to admit that his view of property rights was like highly pluralistic, right? That like, okay, yeah. Like clearly it's not just about mixing your labor with things, right? It's much more about like all of these other things. And we would, have this like very subjective understanding of property rights. It's like, okay, let's just move on from that then and move into the sort of practical considerations and these like or not practical, but these kind of like ideal considerations when it comes to owning a business and what do we mean by freedom. And I just really disagree with that. Guys, I mean, tell me where I'm wrong here. I just really disagree with that conception of freedom. I find it to be, he says, oh, it's like a very scary thing and you're a useful idiot for people that have these authoritarian beliefs. Is like, I really don't think so, because I think that you're much more meaningfully free in a much more egalitarian system. You're more meaningfully free to, get the access to healthcare that you need and, be able to go out and have free time and spend your time doing the things that you want to do instead of things that you're forced to do by an economic system. And when he said, I think that in some sense the fundamental disagreement we have can be summed up in the hypothetical that I asked him, where I said, if we abolished the private ownership of the means of production, but everyone was 10 times richer, would you advocate for it? He would say no, which is basically what he's saying is that I'm prioritizing a person's ability to start a business over being 10 times poorer, right? Like I would take people being 10 times poorer if it just means that they can open a private business. And I don't know, I find that is that just doesn't seem very sensible to me. It's like, and I think when people kind of interact in the world, I don't even think people, as they interact, really value this freedom of being able to ask, if you framed it like that, right? And it wasn't like, oh, clear like socialism versus capitalism kind of thing, right? If you asked people, hey, give me 1 second, guys. Jesus Christ, my wife.